Hello and welcome to another episode, a whole nother book for bedtime stories. My name is Tracy, I'm your host. And now we are reading The Portable Chaucer, revised edition, edited and translated by Theodore Morrison. I was thinking that since this is Chaucer, that it would be in the public domain. I'm now unsure if this translation, which this copy's so old, I've even lost the back cover of this thing. I've been lugging this around for a good piece of years now. And this was most recently copyrighted in 1949. Oh wait, copyright 1975 and 1977. By the author, Mr. Theodore Morrison. So hopefully Mr. Morrison does not take offense at my reading some of his translation and editing of Mr. Chaucer's content. So, we shall begin. This is the prologue, by the way. As soon as April pierces to the root the drought of March, and bathes each bud and shoot through every vein of sap with gentle showers, from whose engendering liquor spring the flowers, when zephyrs have breathed softly all about, inspiring every wood and field to sprout, and in the zodiac the youthful sun his journey halfway through the ram has run, when little birds are busy with their song, who sleep with open eyes the whole night long. Life stirs their hearts and tingles in them so, then people long on pilgrimage to go, and palmers to set out for distant strands, and foreign shrines renowned in sundry lands. And especially in England, people ride to Canterbury from every countryside, to visit there the blessed martyred saint, who gave them strength when they were sick and faint. And Southwark, at the Tabard one spring day, it happened, as I stopped there on my way, myself a pilgrim, with a heart devout, ready for Canterbury to set out. At night came all of 29 assorted travellers, and to that same inn resorted, who by a turn of fortune chanced to fall in fellowship together, and they were all pilgrims who meant toward Canterbury to ride. The rooms and stables were well kept and wide, and we were well provided with the best. And shortly, when the sun had gone to rest, I had so talked with each that presently I was a member of their company, and promised to rise early the next day to start, as I shall show, upon our way. But nonetheless, while I have time and space, before this tale has gone a further pace, I should in reason tell you the condition of each of them, his rank and his position, and also what array they all were in. And so then, with a knight, I will begin. A knight, hang on 2 seconds, I do apologize. Okay, that's better. That's so much better. A knight was with us, and an excellent man, who from the earliest moment he began to follow his career loved chivalry, truth, open-handedness, and courtesy. He was a stout man in the king's campaigns, and in that cause had gripped his horse's reins, in Christian lands and pagan through the earth, none farther, and always honored for his worth. He was on hand at Alexandria's fall. He had often sat in precedence to all the nations at the banquet board in Prussia. He had fought in Lithuania and in Russia. No Christian knight more often. He had been in Moorish Africa at Ben Marin, at the siege of Algeciras in Granada. Said that wrong, I'm sorry. And sailed in many a glorious armada in the Mediterranean, and fought as well at Ias and Italia when they fell, in Armenia and on Asia Minor's coast. Of 15 deadly battles he could boast. In Algeria and Tremesen, fought for the faith and killed 3 separate men in single combat. He had done good work joining against another pagan Turk. With the king of Palathia, and he was wise, despite his prowess, honored in men's eyes, meek as a girl and gentle in his ways, he had never spoken ignobly in all his days. To any man, by even a rude inflection, he was a knight in all things to perfection. He rode a good horse, but his gear was plain, for he had lately served on a campaign. His tunic was still splattered by the rust, left by his coat of mail, for he had just returned and set out on his pilgrimage. His son was with him, a young squire in age, some 20 years as near I could guess. His hair curled as if taken from a press. He was a lover and would become a knight. In stature he was of moderate height, but powerful and wonderfully quick. He had been in Flanders, riding in the thick of forays in Artois and Picardy, and bore up well for one so young as he, still hoping by his exploits in such places to stand the better in his lady's graces. He wore embroidered flowers, red and white, and blazed like a spring meadow to the sight. He sang or played his flute the livelong day. He was as lusty as the month of May. His coat was short, its sleeves were long and wide. He sat his horse well, and knew how to ride, and how to make a song and use his lance, and he could write and draw well, too, and dance. So hot his love that when the moon rose pale, he got no more sleep than a nightingale. He was modest, and helped whomever he was able, and carved as his father's squire at the table. But one more servant had the knight beside, choosing thus simply for the time to ride. A yeoman in a coat and hood of green, his peacock-feathered arrows bright and keen. He carried under his belt in tidy fashion, for well-kept gear he had a yeoman's passion. No bedraggled feather might his arrows show, and in his hand he held a mighty bow. He kept his hair close cropped, his face was brown, he knew the lore of woodcraft, up and down. His arm was guarded from the bowstring's whip by a bracer gaily trimmed. He had at hip a sword and buckler, and at his other side a dagger whose fine mounting was his pride. Sharp-pointed as a spear, his horn he bore in a green sling, and on his chest he wore a silver image of St. Christopher, his patron, since he was a forester. There was also a nun, a prioress, whose smile was gentle and full of guilelessness. By St. Loy was the worst oath she would say. She sang mass well, in a becoming way, intoning through her nose the words divine, and she was known as Madame Eglantine. Eglantine. Jeez. These words, that's not proper English. Why can't they speak proper American back before America was America? Anyway, moving on. She was known as Madame Eglantine. Eek. I'm sure that's wrong. Anyway, we're going to go forward. It's going to continue to be funnier as time goes on. So it's fine. It's fine. She spoke good French, as taught as Stratford Bow. For the Parisian French she did not know. Also at table she was schooled so well that from her lips no morsel ever fell. She wet her fingers lightly in the dish of sauce, for courtesy was her first wish. With every bite she did her skillful best to see that no drop fell upon her breast. She always wiped her upper lip so clean that in her cup was never to be seen a hint of grease when she had drunk her share. She reached out for her meat with comely air. She was a great delight and always tried to imitate court ways and had her pride. Both amiable and gracious in her dealings. Amiable and gracious in her dealings. As for her charity and tender feelings, she melted at whatever was piteous. She wept if she but came upon a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bleeding. Some little dogs that she took pleasure feeding, on roasted meat or milk or good wheat bread, She had, but how she wept to found one dead, or yelping from a blow that made it smart. And all was sympathy and loving heart. Neat was her wimple in its every plate, her nose well formed, her eyes as gray as slate. Her mouth was very small and soft and red. She had so wide a brow, I think her head was nearly a span broad for certainty. She was not undergrown, as all could see. She wore her cloak with dignity and charm. She had her rosary about her arm, the small beads coral and the larger green, and from them hung a brooch of golden sheen. An A inscribed beneath a crown it bore, and under that Omnia vincit amor. A priest accompanied her toward Canterbury, and a nun, and an attendant nun, her secretary. There was a monk, and nowhere his peer, a hunter, and a roving overseer. He was a manly man, and fully able to be an abbot. He kept a hunting stable, and when he rode, the neighborhood could hear his bridle jingling in the wind as clear and loud as if it were a chapel bell. Wherever he was master of a cell, the principles of good Saint Benedict, for being a little old and somewhat strict, were honored in the breach, and past their prime. He lived by the fashion of a newer time. He would have swapped that text for a plucked hen, which says that hunters are not holy men, or a monk outside his discipline and rule is too much like a fish outside his pool, that it to say a monk outside his cloister, but such a text he deemed not worth an oyster. I told him his opinion made me glad. Why should he study always and go mad, mewed in his cell with only a book for neighbor? Or why, as Augustine commanded, labor and sweat his hands? How shall the world be served? To Augustine be all such toil reserved. And so he hunted, as was only right. He had greyhounds as swift as birds in flight. His taste was all for tracking down the hare, and what his sport might cost he did not care. His sleeves, I noticed, where they met his hand, trimmed with grey fur, the finest in the land. His hood was fastened with a curious pin, made of wrought gold and clasped beneath his chin. A love knot at the tip his head might pass, bald as it was for a lump of shining glass. His face was glistening as if anointed. Fat as a lord he was, and well appointed. His eyes were large and rolled inside his head, as if they gleamed from a furnace of hot lead. His boots were supple, his horse superbly kept. He was a prelate to dream of while you slept. He was not pale, nor peaked like a ghost. He relished a plump swan as his favorite roast. He rode a palfrey brown as a ripe berry. A friar was with us, a gay dog and merry, who begged his district with a jolly air. No friar in all 4 orders could compare with him for gallantry. His tongue was wooing, many a girl was married by his doing. And at his own cost it was often done. He was a pillar, and a noble one. To his whole order in the neighborhood, rich franklins knew him well, who served good food, and worthy women welcomed him to town. The license that his order handed down, he said himself, conferred on him possession of more than a curate's power of confession. Sweetly the list of frailties he heard, assigning penance with a pleasant word. He was an easy man for absolution, where he looked forward to a contribution. For if to a poor order a man has given, it signifies that he has been well shriven. And if a sinner let his purse be dented, the friar would stake his oath he had repented. For many men become so hard of heart they cannot weep through though conscience makes them smart. Instead of tears and prayers, then let the sinner supply the poor friars with the price of dinner. For pretty women he had more than shrift. His cape was stuffed with many a little gift. As knives and pins and such like, he could sing a merry note and pluck a tender string, and had no rival at all in balladry. His neck was wider than a fleur de lis, and yet he could have knocked a strong man down. He knew the taverns well in every town. The barmaids and innkeepers pleased his mind better than beggars and lepers and their kind. In his position it was unbecoming among the wretched lepers to go slumming. It mocks all decency. It sews no stitch to deal with such riffraff, but with the rich. With sellers of victuals, that's another thing. Wherever he saw some hope of profiting. None so polite, so humble, he was good. The champion beggar of his brotherhood. Should a woman have no shoes against the snow, so pleasant was his in principio. He'd have her widow's mite before he went. His profits were much greater than his rent. For begging rights within appointed bounds, none of his brethren trespassed on his grounds. He loved as freely as a half-grown whelp. On arbitration days he gave great help. For his cloak was never shiny nor threadbare, like a poor cloistered scholar's. He had an air, as if he were a doctor or a pope. It took stout wool to make his semicope, that plumped out like a bell for portliness. He lisped a bit in his rakishness, to make his English sweeter on his tongue, and twanging his harp to end some song he'd sung. His eyes would twinkle in his head as bright as the stars twinkle on a frosty night. Hubert the gallant friar was by name. Hubert this gallant friar was by name. Among the rest a merchant also came. He wore a forked beard and a beaver hat. From Flanders, high up in the saddle he sat. In figured cloth his boots clasped handsomely, delivering his opinions pompously, always on how his gains might be increased. At all cost he desired the sea policed, from Middelburg to Holland to Orwell. He knew the exchange rates and the time to sell French currency, and there was never yet a man who could have told he was in debt. So grave he seemed, and hid so well his feelings, with all his shrewd engagements and close dealings. You'd find no better man at any turn, but what his name was I could never learn. There was an Oxford student, too, it chanced, already in his logic well advanced. As skinny as a rake the horse he rode, and he himself was hardly a plump load. Rather his look was hollow and sober enough. He wore an outer coat of threadbare stuff. No benefice was yet in his enjoyment, and he was too unworldly for employment in some lay office. At his couch's head his 20 volumes, bound in black and red, of Aristotle's philosophy pleased him more than a rich wardrobe or a gay guitar. For though he knew philosophy could offer promise of gold, there was little in his coffer. Whatever he got by touching up a friend on books and learning, he would promptly send, and busily pray for the soul of anybody who furnished him the wherewithal for study. His scholarship was what he truly heeded. He never spoke a word more than was needed, and that was said with dignity and force, and quick and brief. He was of grave discourse, lending his weight to virtue by his speech, and gladly would he learn, and gladly teach. There was a lawyer, cunning and discreet, who'd often been to St. Paul's porch to meet his clients. He was a sergeant of the law, a man deserving to be held in awe. Or so he seemed, his manner was so wise, he often served as justice of assize, by royal appointment with a broad commission, for his knowledge and his eminent position. He'd many a handsome gift by way of fee. There was no buyer of land as shrewd as he. All ownership to him became fee simple. His titles were never faulty by a pimple. None was so busy as he with case and cause, and yet he seemed much busier than he was. In every case and verdict he was schooled, through the whole record since King William ruled. No one could pick a loophole or a flaw in any lease or contract he might draw. Each statute on the books he knew by rote. He traveled in a plain, silk-belted coat. A franklin traveled in his company, Whiter could never a daisy petal be than was his beard. His ruddy face gave sign he liked his morning sop of toast in wine. He lived in comfort, as he would assure us, for he was a true son of Epicurus, who held the opinion that the only measure of perfect happiness was simply pleasure. Such hospitality did he provide, he was St. Julian to his countryside. His bread and ale were always up to scratch. He had a cellar none on earth could match. There was no lack of pasties in his house, both fish and flesh, and that so plenteous, that where he lived it snowed of meat and drink, with every dish of which a man can think. After the various seasons of the year, he changed his diet for his better cheer. The partridge in his coops were fat as cream. He had a fish pond stocked with pike and bream. Woe to his cook for an unready pot, or sauce that wasn't seasoned and spiced hot. A table in his hall stood on display, prepared and covered through the livelong day. He presided at court sessions for his bounty, and sat in Parliament often for his county. A well-wrought dagger and a purse of silk hung at his belt, as white as morning milk. He'd been a sheriff and county auditor. On earth was no such rich proprietor. There were 5 guildsmen in the livery of one August and great fraternity, a weaver, a dyer, and a carpenter, a tapestry maker, and a haberdasher. Their gear was furbished new and clean as glass. The mountings of their knives were not of brass, but silver. Their pouches were well made and neat, and each of them, it seemed, deserved a seat on the platform at the Guildhall, for each one was likely timber to make an alderman. They had goods enough and money to be spent. Also their wives would willingly consent, and would have been at fault if they had not. For to meet madamed is a pleasant lot, to march in first at feasts for being well married, and royally to have their mantles carried. These guildsmen had a cook with them, their own, to boil their chickens with the marrow bone, with seasoning powder, capers, and sharp spice. In judging London ale, his taste was nice. He knew well how to roast and broil and fry, to mix a stew and bake a good meat pie, or capon creamed with almond, rice, and egg. Pity he had an ulcer on his leg. A skipper was with us, his home far in the west. He came from the port of Dartmouth, as I guessed. He sat his cart-house pretty much at sea, his coarse smock joggling on either knee. A dagger on a string from his neck hung down. Beneath his arm his face was burnished brown. By summer sun he was a true good fellow. Many a time he had tapped a wine cask mellow, sailing from Bordeaux while the owner slept. Too nice a point of honor he never kept. In sea fights, if he got the upper hand, drowned prisoners floated home to every land. In navigation, whether reckoning tides, currents, or what might threaten him besides, harborage, pilotage, or the moon's demeanor, none was his like from Hull to Cartagena. He knew each harbor and the anchorage there, from Gotland to the Cape of Finisterre, and every creek in Brittany and Spain, and he had called his ship the Madeleine. With us came also an astute physician. There was none like him for a disquisition on the art of medicine or surgery, for he was grounded in astrology. He kept his patient long in observation, choosing the proper hour for application of charms and images by intuition, of magic and the planet's best position. For he was one who understood the laws that rule the humors, and could tell the cause that brought on every human malady, whether of hot or cold, or moist or dry. He was a perfect medicio, for sure. The cause once known, he would prescribe the cure. For he had his druggists ready at a motion to furnish the sick man with some pill or potion. To a game of mutual aid, with each one winning, their partnership was hardly just beginning. He was well versed in his authorities, old, oh no, Latin names that I cannot pronounce possibly. Old Aescalpus, Dioscorides, Rufus, and old Hippocrates and Galen, Haley and Rhazes and Serapon, Averroes, Bernard, Johannes Damascenus, Avicennia, Gilbert, Gadsden, Constantinus. He urged a moderate fare on principle, but rich in nourishment, digestible. If nothing in excess would he admit, he gave but little heed to Holy Writ. His clothes were lined with taffeta, their hue was all of blood red and of Persian blue. Yet he was far from careless of expense, he saved his fees from times of pestilence. For gold is a cordial, as physicians hold, and so he had a special love of gold. A worthy woman there was from near the city of Bath, but somewhat deaf, and more's the pity. For weaving she possessed so great a bent, she outdid the people of Ypres and Ghent. No other woman dreamed of such a thing as to precede her at the offering. Or if any did, she fell in such a wrath, she dried up all the charity in Bath. She wore fine handkerchiefs of old-fashioned air, and on a Sunday morning I could swear she had 10 pounds of linen on her head. Her stockings were of finest scarlet red, laced tightly, and her shoes were soft and new. Bold was her face and her hair, and red in hue. She had been an excellent woman all her life. 5 men in turn had taken her to wife, not counting other youthful company, but let that pass for now. Over the sea she'd travelled freely, many a distant stream. She'd crossed and visited Jerusalem. 3 times she'd been at Rome and Boulogne. Bologna? It looks like Bologna, but I know it's French. It's a French city, and I don't know how to say it. Boulogne? I don't know. Maybe. Somebody tell me in the comments. Thanks. At Compostella's shrine and at Cologne. She'd wandered by the way through many a scene. Her teeth were set with little gaps between. Easily on her ambling horse she sat. She was well wimpled, and she wore a hat as wide in circuit as a shield or targe. A skirt swathed up her hips, and they were large. Upon her feet she wore sharp rowelled spurs. She was a good fellow. A ready tongue was hers. All remedies of love she knew by name, for she had all the tricks of that old game. There was a good man of the priest's vocation. A poor town of parson was true consecration. But he was rich in holy thought and work. Learned he was, in the truest sense, a clerk, who meant Christ's gospel faithfully to preach, and truly his parishioners to teach. He was a kind man, full of industry, many times tested by adversity, and always patient. If tithes were in arrears, he was loath to threaten any man with fears of excommunication. Past a doubt, he would rather spread his offering about to his poor flock, or spend his property. To him a little meant sufficiency. Wide was his parish, with houses far asunder, but he would not be kept by rain or thunder, if any had suffered a sickness or a blow, from visiting the farthest, high or low. Plodding his way on foot, his staff in hand, he was a model his flock could understand. For first he did, and afterward he taught, that precept from the gospel he had caught, and added as a metaphor thereto, if the gold rusts, what will the iron do? For if a priest is foul, in whom we trust, no wonder a layman shows a little rust. A shame it is that priests in mind should keep, to let a filthy shepherd tend clean sheep. By his own purity a priest should give the example to his sheep, how they should live. He did not rent his benefice for hire, leaving his flock to flounder in the mire, and run to London, happiest of goals, goals to sing paid masses in St. Paul's for souls, or as a chaplain from some rich guild take his keep, but dwelt at home and guarded well his sheep, so that no wolf should make his flock miscarry. He was a shepherd and not a mercenary, and though himself a man of strict vocation, he was not harsh to weak souls in temptation, not overbearing nor haughty in his speech, but wise and kind in all he tried to teach. By good example and just words to turn sinners to heaven was his whole concern. But should a man in truth prove obstinate, whoever he was, of rich or mean estate, the parson would give him a snub to meet the case. I doubt there was a priest in any place his better. He did not stand on dignity, nor affect in conscience too much nicety, but Christ's and his disciples' word he sought to teach, and first he followed what he taught. 2 seconds. Do apologize. Holy shnikes, this is a very long prologue, but we will continue after I drink a little water. I did a little dance. Let me drink a little water. Okay. Now we continue. There was a plowman with him on the road, his brother, who had forked up many a load of good manure, a hardy worker he, living in peace and perfect charity. Whether his fortune made him smart or smile, he loved God with his whole heart all the while, and his neighbor as himself he would undertake for every luckless poor man, for the sake of Christ, to thresh and ditch and dig by the hour, and with no wage, if it was in his power. His tithes on goods and earnings he paid fair. He wore a coarse, rough coat, and rode a mare. There also were a manciple, a miller, a reeve, a summoner, and a pardoner, and this makes our company complete. As tough a yokel as you'd care to meet. The miller was. His big beefed arms and thighs took many a ram put up as wrestling prize. He was a thick, squat-shouldered lump of sins, no door but he could heave it off its pins, or break it running at it with his head. His beard was broader than a shovel, and red as a fat sow or fox. A wart stood clear atop his nose, and red as a pig's ear. A tuft of bristles on it, black and wide, his nostrils were. He carried at his side a sword and buckler. His mouth would open out like a great furnace, and he would sing and shout his ballads and jokes of harlotries and crimes. He could steal corn and charge for it 3 times. And yet was honest enough as millers come. For a miller, as they say, has a gold thumb. In white coat and blue hood, this lusty clown, blowing his bagpipes, brought us out of town. The manciple was of the lawyer's college, and other buyers might have used his knowledge, how to be shrewd provisioners, for whether he bought on cash or credit, altogether he managed that the end should be the same. He came out more than even with the game. Now isn't it an instance of God's grace, how one of little knowledge can keep pace, in wit, with a whole school of learned men? Has masters, to the number of 3 times 10, knew every twist of equity and tort. A dozen in that very inn of court were worthy to be steward of the estate to any of England's lords, however great, and keep him to his income well confined, and free from debt unless he lost his mind, or let him scrimp, if he were mean in bounty. They could have given help to a whole county, if any sort of case that might befall, and yet this manciple could cheat them all. The reeve was a slender, fiery-tempered man. He shaved as close as a razor can. His hair was cropped about his ears and shorn above his forehead as a priest's is worn. His legs were very long and very lean. No calf on his lank spindles could be seen. But he knew how to keep a barn or bin, to play the game with auditors and win. He knew well how to judge by drought and rain the harvest of his seed and of his grain. His master's cattle, swine, His master's cattle, swine, and poultry flock, horses and sheep and dairy, all his stock, were altogether in this reeve's control, and by agreement he had given the soul, accounting since his lord reached 20 years, no man could ever catch him in arrears. There wasn't a bailiff, shepherd, or farmer working, but the reeve knew his tricks of cheating and shirking. He would not let him draw an easy breath. They feared him as they feared the very death. He lived in a good house on an open space, well shaded by green trees, a pleasant place. Shrewder in acquisition than his lord, with private riches he was amply stored. He'd learned a good trade, young by work and will. He was a carpenter of first-rate skill. On a fine mount, a stallion dappled gray, whose name was Scott, he rode along the way. He wore a long blue coat hitched up and tied, as if it were a friar's, and at his side a sword with rusty blade was hanging down. He came from Norfolk, from nearby the town, that men call Baldwell. As we rode the while, the reeve kept always hindmost in our file. A summoner in our company had his place, red as the fiery cherubim his face, pock-marked and pimpled, his eyes were narrow, as lecherous he was as a cock-sparrow. His brows were scabby and black, and thin his beard. His was a face that little children feared. Brimstone or litharge brought in any quarter, quicksilver, ceruse, borax, oil of tartar, no salve nor ointment that will cleanse or bite could cure him of his blotches, livid white, or of the knobs and nubbins on his cheeks. He loved his garlic, his onions, and his leeks. He loved to drink the strong wine down blood red. Then he bellow as if he had lost his head. Then when he had drunk enough to parch his drouth, nothing but Latin issued from his mouth. He'd smattered up a few terms, 2 or 3, that he had gathered out of some decree, that he had gathered, I've read it twice, that no wonder he heard law Latin all the day, and everyone knows a parrot or a jay can cry out what or pole as well as the Pope. But give him a strange term, he began to grope. His little store of learning was paid out, so quaestio quod juris he would shout. He was a good-hearted bastard and a kind one. If there were better, it was hard to find one. He'd let a good fellow, for a quart of wine, a whole year round enjoy his concubine. Scot-free from summons, hearing fine or bail, and on the sly he too could flush a quail. If he liked a scoundrel, no matter for church law, he would teach him that he need not stand in awe. If the archdeacon threatened with his curse, that is, unless his soul was in his purse. For in his purse he would be punished well. The purse, he said, is the archdeacon's hell. Of course, I know he lied in what he said. Surely a guilty man should hold in dread the curse that damns by excommunication, while absolution brings him salvation. And let him heed, if higher counsels fail, the writ remanding the accursed to jail. Within his power, and well he saw to this, he had the young girls of the diocese. He knew their secrets, heard their least design. A garland big enough to be the sign, outside an alehouse, balanced on his head. A shield he bore, a great round loaf of bread. That's the kind of shield I can get behind. I'm just saying. There was a partner of Roncesvalles with him, of Blessed Mary's Hospital. but now came straight from Rome, or so said he. Loudly he sang, "Come hither, love, to me." The summoner's counterbass trolled out profound, no trumpet blew with half so vast a sound. This pardoner had hair as yellow as wax, hanging as smoothly as a hank of flax. His locks trailed down in bunches from his head. He let the ends about his shoulders spread, but in thin clusters lying one by one, of hood, for rakishness, he would have none. For in his wallet he kept it safely stowed. He travelled, as he thought, in the latest mode. Dishevelled, save for his cap, his head was bare, and in his eyes he glittered like a hare. A Veronica was stitched upon his cap. His wallet lay before him in his lap, brimful of pardons from the very seat. In Rome he had a voice like a goat's bleat. He had no beard, and never would have a beard. His cheek was always smooth, as if just sheared. I think he was a geldling, or a mayor, but in his trade, from Berwick down to Ware, no pardoner could beat him in the race, for in his wallet he had a pillow-case, which he pretended was Our Lady's veil. He said he had a piece of the very sail St. Peter, when he fished in Galilee, before Christ caught him, used upon the sea. He had a Latin cross embossed with stones, and in a glass he carried some pig's bones. And with these holy relics, when he found some village parson grubbing his poor ground, he'd get more money in a single day than in 2 months would come the parson's way. Thus, with his flattery and his trumped-up stock, he made dupes of the parson and of his flock. But though his conscience was a little plastic, he was in church a noble ecclesiastic. Well could he read the scripture or saint's story, but best of all he sang the offertory. For he knew well that when this song was sung, then he must preach and sharpen up his tongue, to rake in cash as well he knew the art, and so he sang out gaily, with full heart. Now I have set down briefly, as it was, our rank, our dress, our number, and the cause that made our sundry fellowship begin in Southwark, at this hospitable inn, known as the Tabard, not far from the Bell. But what we did that night I ought to tell, and after that our journey, stage by stage, and the whole story of our pilgrimage. But first, in justice, do not look askance, I plead, nor lay it to my ignorance. If in this matter I should use plain speech, and tell you just the words and style of each, reporting all their language faithfully, it must be known to you as well as me, that whoso tells a story after a man must follow him as closely as he can. If he relates the tale, he must be true to every word, unless he would find new, or else invent a thing or falsify. Better some breadth of language than a lie. He may not spare the truth to save his brother. He might as well use one word as another. In Holy Writ Christ spoke in a broad sense, and surely his word is without offense. Plato, if his are pages you can read, says let the word be cousin to the deed. So I petition your indulgence for it, if I have cut the cloth just as men wore it. Here in this tale, and shown its very weave, my wits are none too sharp, you must believe. Our host gave each of us a cheerful greeting, and promptly of our supper had us eating. The victuals that he served us were his best. The wine was potent, and we drank with zest. Our host cut such a figure, all in all, he might have been a marshal in a hall. He was a big man, and his eyes bulged wide. No sturdier citizen lived in all Cheapside. Lacking no trace of manhood, bold in speech, prudent and well-versed in what life can teach, and with all this he was a jovial man, and so when supper ended, he began to jolly us when all our debts were clear. Welcome, he said, I have not seen this year so merry a company in this tavern as now, and I would give you pleasure if I knew how. And just this very minute a plan has crossed my mind that might amuse you at no cost. Another country heard from, my belly rumbles. I shall eat soon, I promise. I have 2 more pages. 3, if you count the one that I just kind of started. So, and just this very minute a plan has crossed my mind that might amuse you at no cost. You go to Canterbury, may the Lord speed you, and may the martyred saint reward your journey, and to while the time away, you mean to talk and pass the time of day? For you would be as cheerful all alone as riding on your journey dumb as stone. Therefore, if you'll abide by what I say, tomorrow when you ride off on your way, now by my father's soul, and he is dead, you shall enjoy yourselves, or lop my head. Hold up your cups, if you accept my speech. Our counsel did not take us long to reach. We bade him give his orders at his will. Well, sirs, he said, then do not take it ill, but hear me in good part, and for your sport, each one of you, to make our journey short, shall tell 2 tales as we ride, I mean toward Canterbury, and coming home again. Shall tell 2 other tales he may have heard of happenings that sometime have occurred. And that one of you whose stories please us most, here in this tavern, sitting by this post, shall sup at our expense, while we make merry, when we come riding home from Canterbury. To cheer you still the more, I too will ride with you at my own cost, and be your guide. But should my judgment anyone gainsay, he'll foot the bill, will run up on the way. If you agree, no need to stand and reason. Tell me, and I'll be stirring in good season. This thing was granted, and we swore our pledge to take his judgment on our pilgrimage. His verdict on our tales and his advice, he was to plan a supper at a price. Agreed upon, and so we all assented to his command, and we were well contented. The wine was fetched, we drank, and went to rest. Next morning, when the dawn was in the east, up sprang our host, who acted as our cock, and gathered us together in a flock. And off we rode, till presently our pace had brought us to St. Thomas's watering place. And there our host began to check his horse. Good sirs, he said, you know your pledge, of course. Shall I remind you what it was about? If evensong and matins don't fall out, we'll soon find who shall tell us the first tale. But as I hope to drink my wine and ale, whoever won't accept what I decide pays everything we spend along the ride. Draw lots before we're farther from the inn. Whoever draws the shortest shall begin. Sir Knight, said he, my master, choose your straw. Come here, my lady prioress, and draw. And you, Sir Scholar, don't look pensive, man. Pitch in now, everyone. So all began to draw the lots, and as the luck would fall, the draw went to the knight, which pleased us all. And when this excellent man saw how it stood, ready to keep his promise, he said, Good. Since it appears that I must start the game, why then the draw is welcome, in God's name. Now let's ride on, and listen what I say. And with that word we rode forth on our way, and he, with his courteous manner and good cheer, began to tell his tale, as you shall hear. That's all for now. Have a good night. Sleep well. I'm still figuring it out. We'll figure it out. Production quality will improve as time goes on.